Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. At the heart of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire lies the Triwizard Tournament, an ancient and extremely dangerous competition between three magical schools. Each champion was required to prove their skill, courage, and ingenuity by completing trials where the cost of a mistake could be far too high. Harry Potter was drawn into the tournament against his will, and along with him, viewers and readers witnessed the events both through his eyes and from the perspectives of other key characters. Although the tournament fits perfectly into the plot and atmosphere of the book, a closer look reveals quite a few strange and openly illogical moments. That is exactly what we are going to talk about today. Enjoy watching. Number 1. Why was the tournament revived at all? If we step away from narrative necessity for a moment, the decision to revive the Triwizard Tournament looks, to put it mildly, questionable. Until 1792, the tournament was held once every 5 years, but in that fateful year, a basilisk attacked the heads of the three schools and the judges. The outcome was predictable. The competition was shut down as too dangerous and outdated. And then, 200 years later, in a relatively peaceful and civilized era, someone decided that bringing back a deadly tournament right onto school grounds was a great idea. From a common-sense perspective, something like an inter-school Quidditch championship would have made far more sense, safer, more spectacular, and without risking students' lives. Instead, the magical community chose to tempt fate once again. Number 2. Why cancel Quidditch? For the sake of the Triwizard Tournament, Hogwarts cancelled the Hogwarts Quidditch Cup, an annual event students eagerly prepare for and genuinely love. This raises a logical question. Why sacrifice one competition for another? The only real scheduling conflict would have been the third task, and even that could have been easily rescheduled. At worst, Gryffindor and Hufflepuff would have lost one player each, and only if Harry and Cedric had been unable to balance training with tournament preparation. From an in-universe logic standpoint, this decision feels extremely odd. Number 3. What's in it for the spectators? Quidditch offers speed, emotion, and engagement. Every house cheers for its team, and spectators can always see what's happening on the field. So what does the tournament offer instead? The first task is exciting and intense, a dragon fight in full view of everyone. The second task has the champions disappear underwater for an entire hour while spectators simply stare at the surface of the Black Lake with no idea what's actually happening below. The third task takes place in a maze completely hidden from view, the main event of the school year, which for the most part is impossible to watch. It gives the impression that spectacle was never seriously considered. Number 4. A loophole in the binding magical contract. Before tossing a name into the Goblet of Fire, a student was meant to understand one crucial thing. It was a binding magical contract. Whoever's name the goblet chose was obligated to participate in the tournament. That is why Harry supposedly couldn't refuse. He was said to be bound by the contract, despite his age and lack of voluntary participation. But let's recall the details. In the second task, Fleur Delacour failed to complete the challenge and effectively dropped out, without any consequences. In the third task, any champion could signal for help and withdraw. This leads to a logical question. What is the point of a magical contract if you can quit in the very first minute of any task? Number 5. A strange registration system. To enter the tournament, all one had to do was be over 17 and toss a piece of parchment with a name into the Goblet of Fire. But what stopped someone from sabotaging another student? For instance, what if Draco Malfoy had convinced an older student to submit Harry's name instead? Technically, the rules wouldn't have been broken. A far more logical system would have been one where the goblet accepted names from anyone, but only selected those who truly met the age requirement. Number 6. What if Harry had simply refused? Harry ended up trapped. His name was thrown into the goblet, additional manipulations were performed, and suddenly he was a champion. But what would have happened if he had simply refused to participate? How does a contract work with someone who never directly interacted with the goblet? Logically, the obligation should fall on the person who submitted the name, not the one written on the parchment. This point remains without a clear explanation. Number 7, only one winner, the rules say it clearly. 1 cup, 1 winner. 3 champions enter, but only 1 leaves with glory. The judges keep scores, they argue over points. Ludo Bagman announces them with excitement. "You did very well, Potter," he says after the first task. And yet those numbers slowly lose their meaning. By the final night, the tournament forgets them entirely. Everything comes down to speed, not skill, not consistency, just who reaches the cup first. Cedric Diggory proves the flaw. He performs well throughout the tournament. So does Harry. Victor Crumb fights through curses. Fleur struggles, but survives. All of that effort is erased in the maze. 1 wrong turn, 1 spell, 1 delay. The cup does not care about points. It does not remember earlier victories. It rewards arrival, not merit. The judges score every task, but the tournament ignores them. And in the end, the prize is not justice, it is chance. Number 8, adults' indifference to danger. The danger is never hidden. Dragons roar behind chains. The black lake waits, dark and alive. The maze shifts and breathes, filled with spells meant to confuse, trap, or break the mind. Yet the adults watch calmly from the stands. Judges take notes. Dumbledore observes in silence. The risk of death is treated as acceptable, almost traditional. When Molly Weasley later cries, "He's just a boy," her fear feels out of place in a world that has already decided danger is part of the lesson. What makes it worse is that this was not ignorance. It was history. The tournament had been cancelled before because people died. Everyone knew that. And still, the headmaster agreed. No mass protest from parents. No. Public outcry? No pause. The adults trusted old traditions more than living children. In the wizarding world, logic bends easily when magic is involved, and common sense is often the first casualty. Number 9. Who checked the safety of the tasks? The tasks were meant to be controlled, planned, safe enough to survive. Dragons were chained, the lake was monitored, the maze was guarded. At least that was the idea. Yet behind every task stood a single man quietly pulling strings. Mad-Eye Moody, or rather Barty Crouch Jr. in disguise. He had access to everything, the champions, the judges, the spells, and no one questioned it. Not once. The signs were everywhere. Moody pushes Harry toward the Triwizard Cup. He insists, play to your strengths. He hands out advice too precise to be innocent. He turns the cup into a portkey without raising suspicion. An object meant to crown a champion becomes a trap. A direct path to a graveyard. All of this happens under the noses of experienced wizards. Dumbledore, Snape, McGonagall, the same people trusted to keep children alive. That is the true failure. The tournament was built for spectacle first, safety second, no independent inspections, no real oversight. The organizers trusted appearances over vigilance. And the price was paid in blood. Cedric Diggory dies because the system looked impressive, but no one checked who was really in control. The magic was complex, the security was not. Number 10. Why was Harry allowed? Without guardian consent, Harry Potter is 14. That fact alone should have stopped everything. Other students needed permission slips, letters home, signatures. This was a tournament with dragons, dark spells, and the real possibility of death. Yet no one asks about the Dursleys, no owl is sent to Privet Drive, no form is filed. Dumbledore simply states, Harry must compete. And the school accepts it, as if guardianship suddenly stops mattering the moment magic is involved. The excuse is always the same. The goblet has chosen, the contract is binding, but binding on whom? Harry never entered his name. He never agreed. He never gave consent. If the rules protect underage students in every other dangerous activity, why do they vanish here? Minerva McGonagall, who once snapped, "He is far too young for this," raises the concern, and then lets it drop. No appeal, no challenge, no attempt to delay. It reveals a quiet contradiction. Hogwarts claims to protect its students, yet when the rules fail, procedure replaces responsibility. The adults hide behind ancient magic instead of questioning it. A 14-year-old boy is sent into mortal danger without parental consent because no one wants to admit the system is flawed. And in that moment, the tournament stops being a test of champions. It becomes a test of conscience, and it is the adults who fail. Number 11, nobody noticed the goblet's malfunction. It happens in a single moment. The Goblet of Fire spits out 3 names as expected: Fleur Delacour, Victor Crumb, Cedric Diggory. The room relaxes, then the blue flames surge again. A 4th parchment falls. "Harry Potter," Dumbledore reads aloud. Shock ripples through the hall, murmurs, gasps. But that shock quickly fades into acceptance. No alarms, no emergency response. The most sacred artifact of the tournament behaves impossibly, and no one treats it like a crime scene. This is what makes the moment unsettling. Hogwarts is not short on powerful minds. Albus Dumbledore stands there, a wizard who defeated Grindelwald. Minerva McGonagall, sharp and disciplined, watches closely. Severus Snape, suspicious by nature, says nothing. And yet none of them demand an immediate examination of the goblet. No spells are cast to check interference, no enchantments are peeled back. The judges simply move on as if ancient magic never malfunctions, as if corruption is impossible. The goblet is not a toy. It is described as an ancient, impartial judge bound to powerful magic. Dumbledore himself admits the Goblet of Fire is an extremely powerful magical object. Powerful objects invite manipulation, especially in a castle already marked by past dark magic. A 4th champion is not a minor glitch. It is proof that something or someone has breached the system, and yet the tournament continues as planned. Dragons are brought in, tasks are scheduled. The anomaly is ignored. Only later do we learn the truth. Barty Crouch Jr. confesses that he bewitched the goblet, forcing it to see Harry as a champion from a 4th school. The revelation lands with bitter clarity. The signs were always there. The warning came early, but no one looked closely enough when it mattered. The goblet screamed that something was wrong. Hogwarts listened and chose to look away. Number 12, the Ministry's total inaction. And then there is the silence. The Ministry of Magic is everywhere in the wizarding world. It regulates brooms. It controls ports. It sends letters, inspectors, warnings. Yet during the most dangerous school event in decades, it all but vanishes. No extra auras at Hogwarts, no independent oversight. Cornelius Fudge attends the first task, applauds politely, and leaves. When dragons, curses, and ancient artifacts are involved, the Ministry watches from a safe distance and does nothing. Even when things begin to go wrong, the response is the same. A dark mark appears in the sky at the Quidditch World Cup, and panic spreads. Soon after, Harry's name comes out of the goblet, a 4th champion, an impossible outcome. This alone should have triggered immediate intervention. Instead, the Ministry accepts it. Barty Crouch Sr. coldly declares, "The rules are absolute. The goblet has spoken." No investigation, no delay, no concern for how the rules were broken in the first place. The true test comes at the end. Cedric Diggory is dead. A 14-year-old boy returns, clutching his body, shaking, telling a story no one wants to hear. Harry says Voldemort is back. He names Peter Pettigrew. He describes a ritual: flesh, blood, bone. Fudge listens and refuses. He's been confused, the minister insists. He's been traumatized. Trauma becomes the excuse. Denial becomes policy. What follows is not action, but avoidance. A brief, hollow investigation. No public warning, no preparation, no protection. The ministry chooses comfort over truth, control over responsibility. By the time they finally act, it is too late. The tournament did not just expose flaws in magical contracts and ancient spells, it revealed something far worse. When danger returned, the ministry looked away. And that silence cost lives. Number 13, how could you fake the age line? The scene is played for laughs. Fred and George Weasley swagger up to the goblet, drink an aging potion, and for a brief, glorious moment believe they have beaten Albus Dumbledore himself. Then the spell snaps shut. White beards explode from their faces, and Dumbledore calmly remarks, "I rather thought you'd try that." It's funny, memorable, and theatrical. But once the laughter fades, an uncomfortable question remains. If the most powerful wizard in the school protects the age line, why is it even possible to fool it with a potion brewed from a student textbook? The aging potion is not dark magic. It's not ancient, forbidden knowledge. It's a basic potion taught at Hogwarts, something competent students can make with the right ingredients. If Fred and George could think of it, then so could others. Older students, visiting wizards, even someone like Barty Crouch Jr., who later manipulates the goblet itself. The story asks us to believe that Dumbledore's spell is unbreakable, yet it is treated like a simple obstacle. One trick, one sip, one step away from success. That raises a deeper problem. The age line is supposed to be absolute. Dumbledore himself says, "I have written an age line around the goblet." Not a suggestion, not a warning, a hard, magical barrier. And yet the Goblet of Fire, an ancient artifact capable of enforcing a binding magical contract, fails to recognize false age entirely. It doesn't pause, it doesn't reject the deception, it simply waits, as if age were checked by nothing more than a surface-level charm. This turns the whole system into a paradox. The age restriction looks strict, but behaves like a flimsy filter, easy to test, easy to bypass. If the goblet can be fooled about age, why should we believe it cannot be fooled about identity, intent, or consent? The Weasley twins fail for comic timing, not because the magic is flawless, and once you see that, the laughter gives way to doubt, not about the twins, but about the spell itself. Number 14, Hagrid and the Dragons, a safe choice. Rubeus. Hagrid was entrusted with the dragons at the Triwizard tournament not because the decision was sensible, but because it perfectly reflected Hogwarts' long-standing habit of replacing logic with sentiment. Hagrid's reputation as a lover of magical creatures preceded him everywhere, often drowning out the more uncomfortable truth. His affection consistently overrode his judgment. This was the man who raised a dragon hatchling in a wooden hut, who believed Acromantulus deserved understanding, and who once described a blast-ended Scroot as misunderstood. Entrusting him with 4 full-grown aggressive dragons, Hungarian Horntail among them, was not a calculated professional choice, but an emotional reflex rooted in institutional familiarity. The Triwizard tournament itself was framed as a return to ancient tradition, and tradition at Hogwarts often meant accepting danger with a shrug. The narrative voice of the book itself admits that the tournament was notoriously dangerous, with a death toll that once forced its cancellation. Against that backdrop, assigning Hagrid to dragon duty seems less like a singular lapse and more like a symptom of a broader cultural blind spot. The school had normalized peril to such an extent that the presence of dragons on the grounds felt less alarming than the possibility of delegating responsibility to outsiders who might question the headmaster's authority. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry had access to qualified professionals. The Romanian dragon sanctuary existed, staffed by trained magizoologists whose daily work involved restraining, transporting, and rehabilitating dragons. In fact, Charlie Weasley himself worked there, providing a direct, personal link to expert oversight. Yet the sanctuary's handlers were treated as logistical support rather than decision-makers. They delivered the dragons, erected the chains, and stood guard. But the emotional stewardship, feeding, calming, and acclimatizing the creatures fell to Hagrid, whose enthusiasm was mistaken for competence. The book offers a revealing narrative detail when Hagrid proudly shows Harry the dragons in advance, his face glowing with excitement. This glow is not framed as professional confidence, it is childlike awe. Hagrid's inability to separate wonder from responsibility is a recurring motif in the series, and nowhere is it more dangerous than here. The fact that he leaks the secret of the first task so easily underscores why entrusting him with such creatures was reckless. A man who cannot keep a secret about dragons should not be placed in charge of dragons during a life-threatening competition. Harry Potter benefits directly from this lapse, and the narrative quietly relies on it. Harry's survival in the first task hinges on foreknowledge. Without it, facing a Hungarian horntail would have been nearly suicidal. The book notes that dragons were among the most difficult magical creatures to tame, a line that reads less like flavor text and more like a quiet indictment of the adults involved. Hagrid's decision to show Harry the dragons was an emotional impulse, not a calculated intervention, and the story treats it as both a kindness and a flaw. Minerva McGonagall's reaction to the tournament preparations is telling precisely because of its restraint. She does not openly rebel, but her visible discomfort signals dissent within the staff. McGonagall represents order, rules, and controlled risk. Her silence here suggests that the decision to involve Hagrid was not reached through consensus, but deference. The institution trusted Dumbledore's instincts implicitly, even when those instincts favored loyalty over logic. Barty Crouch Sr., a man defined by procedure and law, also fails to intervene meaningfully. His presence as a ministry representative should have introduced bureaucratic oversight, yet he remains curiously passive. The book describes him as strained and distracted, which retroactively explains his inaction, but within the moment it reads as complicity. If even Crouch, a symbol of rigid control, accepts Hagrid's role without protest, it reveals how normalized recklessness had become within wizarding governance. The dragons themselves are not treated as neutral obstacles, but as semi-mythic embodiments of chaos. The Hungarian horntail's description, barbed tail, iron-black scales, fire hot enough to melt stone, underscores how absurd it was to entrust their handling to someone emotionally compromised by affection. Hagrid's belief that they're only dangerous if you provoke 'em echoes his earlier defenses of far less manageable creatures, and the narrative never fully challenges this worldview, choosing instead to benefit from it when heroes survive. Triwizard Tournament was designed to test champions, not staff, yet Hagrid's involvement shifts the risk outward. The champions face danger knowingly. Hagrid exposes himself and others through negligence. His role blurs the boundary between organizer and participant, a thematic confusion that runs throughout the tournament. Adults who should control the narrative instead become unpredictable variables, leaving teenagers to compensate with ingenuity and luck. There is also a deeper emotional logic at play. Hagrid embodies Hogwarts' heart, its resistance to cold professionalism. By assigning him the dragons, the school reaffirms its identity as a place where love for magical creatures is valued above technical mastery. This sentimentality is seductive but dangerous. The book subtly critiques it through consequence rather than commentary, allowing readers to recognize the flaw without explicit condemnation. The presence of the dragon handlers from Romania exposes the contradiction. These men and women are described as stern, efficient, and wary, their burns and scars visible proof of experience. They chain the dragons tightly, maintain constant vigilance, and treat the creatures with respectful distance. Hagrid, by contrast, approaches them with open delight. The juxtaposition is deliberate, highlighting that expertise often looks less magical than enthusiasm and therefore less welcome at Hogwarts. Dumbledore's silence on the matter is perhaps the most troubling element. As headmaster, he orchestrates the tournament's return and approves its logistics. His trust in Hagrid is personal, rooted in decades of loyalty and shared secrets, yet leadership demands the ability to override affection when lives are at stake. The book's refusal to address this directly leaves readers to grapple with the unsettling implication that wisdom and negligence can coexist in positions of power. Number 15, no one noticed. Moody wasn't moody. The year of the Triwizard tournament unfolded under the shadow of a man everyone believed they knew. Alastair Moody, legendary aura, survivor of countless ambushes, paranoiac hero of the previous war, entered Hogwarts limping, scarred, growling, and immediately commanding respect. His reputation did most of the work for him. Students whispered about his magical eye that could see through walls, teachers deferred to his experience, and even those who found him unsettling accepted it as part of the package. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, fear becomes camouflage and legend replaces scrutiny. From the first lesson, Moody behaves in ways that should have raised alarms. He openly demonstrates the unforgivable curses, something no professor before him dared to do. The text records his cold authority. You need to know what you're up against. You need to be prepared. Yet the sheer audacity of these lessons is interpreted not as a warning sign, but as proof of authenticity. Only a real Mad-Eye Moody, everyone assumes, would dare to show students the Cruciatus Curse in action. His cruelty is rationalized as realism, his excesses forgiven as battle scars of a hardened veteran. Minerva McGonagall, who has taught at Hogwarts for decades, notices his severity but never questions his identity. Her objections are limited to educational boundaries, not personal suspicion. When she protests the use of dark magic in class, it is framed as a professional disagreement, not a moral emergency. The possibility that this is not Moody at all never enters her thoughts. In a castle that once harbored a possessed Defense Against the Dark Arts professor and later a werewolf, the idea of prolonged impersonation somehow feels less plausible than accepting a colleague's sudden extremity. Albus Dumbledore's trust is perhaps the most striking silence of all. He invites Moody personally, installs him in a position of enormous influence, and allows him unrestricted access to students and tournament infrastructure. Dumbledore, who once detected Tom Riddle's darkness as a schoolboy, does not pierce the disguise. The narrative offers small moments that now read like tragic irony. Constant vigilance, Moody repeats, a mantra that Dumbledore himself seems to momentarily forget. Trust in this case becomes the blind spot of wisdom. Students interact with Moody daily, and none more closely than Harry Potter himself. Harry senses something odd, yet interprets it through the lens of intimidation rather than deception. Moody's fixation on him, his insistence that Harry be prepared for the worst, even his private encouragements are perceived as rough mentorship. When Moody gives Harry advice about surviving the maze, the guidance feels benevolent, almost protective. The reader later understands that every helpful gesture was calculated, every nudge steering Harry toward the graveyard. Even those who knew the real Moody best fail spectacularly. Arthur Weasley, a man intimately familiar with aura culture, notices the professor's injuries and odd behavior, but attributes them to trauma and age. The magical eye that swivels unnaturally, sometimes staring through Harry's cloak, is unsettling, yet again explained away. In a world where magical prosthetics exist, strangeness is normalized. The wizarding community is accustomed to eccentricity. Danger hides comfortably behind it. The castle itself becomes an accomplice. Hogwarts has long been portrayed as a place where secrets thrive, moving staircases, hidden rooms, ghosts with unfinished business. The idea that someone could impersonate another for an entire year fits disturbingly well into its architecture. When Polyjuice Potion is used in earlier years, it is treated as a short-term trick. The thought that it could sustain a deception for months, supported by meticulous planning and magical skill, never truly registers as a possibility. The behavior of the magical eye deserves particular scrutiny. It moves independently, peers through solid objects, and at one point seems to fixate on Harry beneath his invisibility cloak. This alone should have sparked investigation. Instead, it becomes another anecdote in the growing legend of Moody's paranoia. The eye's autonomy is not questioned because Moody himself is known for distrusting everything. The impersonator understands this perfectly. Excess paranoia becomes the shield that protects the lie. The Triwizard tournament itself creates the perfect distraction. With foreign schools present, dragons chained on the grounds, and merpeople lurking beneath the lake, attention is scattered. Danger is expected, even welcomed. When students whisper that something feels wrong, that the year is darker than usual, their instincts are swallowed by spectacle. Chaos becomes cover. In such an atmosphere, a single man behaving strangely fades into the background noise of crisis. Barty Crouch Jr., hidden beneath the guise of Moody, exploits institutional arrogance. Hogwarts believes itself immune to long-term infiltration. It caught a possessed teacher, exposed a werewolf, and survived countless threats. This history breeds complacency. The school assumes it will always notice evil in time. Crouch's success is not just personal brilliance, but systemic failure. Evil does not announce itself. It adapts, studies, and waits. One of the most chilling lines comes late, after the truth is revealed. I kept him alive. Kept him right here. The real Moody was imprisoned within his own home, close enough that colleagues could have sensed something wrong had they looked. That physical proximity underscores the tragedy. The truth was not hidden in some distant fortress. It was locked in a magical trunk under everyone's feet. The silence around Moody's transformation reflects a broader theme in the series. Authority often goes unquestioned when it wears the right face. Uniforms, reputations, and past heroism replace verification. The defense against the dark arts classroom, meant to teach vigilance, becomes the stage for the greatest deception of the year. Students learn curses, but not skepticism. They are taught how to fight evil, not how to recognize it when it smiles. Number 16. The second task's purposeful vagueness. The night air around the Black Lake carried a deceptive calm, the sort that in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire often hides institutional blind spots beneath ceremonial grandeur. The second task of the Triwizard tournament was announced with pomp, yet its true mechanism was deliberately obscured. Champions were told only that they would need to retrieve what has been taken from the depths, a phrase that sounded like a riddle but functioned as a psychological blindfold. The omission was not merely logistical, it was emotional. When a school orchestrates fear without disclosure, it ceases to test skill alone and begins to manipulate trust, especially when the stakes involve human bonds rather than abstract obstacles. For Harry Potter, the weeks leading up to the task were defined by speculation and anxiety, a narrative tension the book renders with stark clarity. The champions were given no guarantee that the loss was symbolic. The text notes the weight of this uncertainty with the line that what lay in the lake was something the champion would sorely miss. That wording is chillingly vague. It invites panic, because it allows the mind to wander toward permanence. In a tournament already infamous for its body count, the lack of reassurance turns preparation into a moral gamble. Train as if the hostages are safe, or act as if delay means death. The cruelty of the design becomes sharper when considering Ron Weasley, who would later awaken beneath the water, enchanted and immobilized. Ron had no consent in becoming the emotional leverage for a task he did not choose. The book's narration later remarks that he had been placed there as the thing Harry would miss most, a sentimental judgment rendered by officials rather than by Harry himself. The champions were not only tested on magical ingenuity but on how convincingly they believed the institution would not cross an ethical line it had never clearly defined. Hermione Granger embodies the contradiction most clearly. She trusted the rules enough to research solutions and remain calm, yet she was also transformed into an object of risk, suspended beneath the surface as a silent consequence of the champion's ignorance. The narrative describes her later reflection that she had been perfectly safe, but that knowledge arrives only after the ordeal. During the task itself, safety was an assumption, not a promise. A school that prides itself on rationality asked its brightest minds to operate in the dark, as if uncertainty itself were an acceptable teaching tool. The problem deepens when examining Cedric Diggory, whose sense of fairness is repeatedly emphasized in the novel. Cedric approached the lake believing the task to be timed, not moral. When he chose to return only with his hostage, he acted under the impression that the rules were absolute and the consequences limited. The book later frames his decision as honorable, yet that honor rests on incomplete information. Had Cedric believed that leaving another hostage meant death, his choice would have been transformed from sportsmanship into potential guilt. For Fleur Delacour, the secrecy proved almost catastrophic. Fleur's inability to rescue her sister led to visible distress, and the narration underscores her terror rather than her failure. The judge's later reassurances that no harm would come ring hollow in retrospect. If the institution never intended to endanger the hostages, why permit champions to believe that they might? Fleur's panic was not a flaw in character. It was a rational response to a scenario designed without emotional transparency. Victor Crumb approached the challenge with brutal efficiency, transfiguring himself to survive underwater. His focus on the physical solution suggests that the task rewarded biological adaptation over ethical reflection. Yet even he hesitated, uncertain whether rescuing only his own hostage was sufficient. The lake became a stage where compassion, fear, and rule-following collided, all because the organizers refused to clarify whether time equaled life. Hovering above it all was Albus Dumbledore, whose presence at the judges' table symbolized wisdom and restraint. The book describes the headmaster watching serenely, a word that feels unsettling given the distress unfolding below. Dumbledore later explains that the hostages were never in danger, but this reassurance arrives after the fact, as if revelation were a reward rather than a prerequisite. The educational philosophy implied here suggests that fear can be pedagogical, that withholding truth sharpens character. Yet the cost is trust, and once eroded, trust is not easily restored. The lake itself becomes a metaphor for institutional opacity. Its depths hide not monsters but people, rendered voiceless for the sake of spectacle. The narration's description of the water as dark and icy mirrors the emotional coldness of the decision-making process. By transforming loved ones into prizes, the tournament blurred the line between challenge and coercion. The champion's courage was genuine, but it was extracted under false pretenses. One could argue that the Triwizard tournament has always been dangerous, that participants accept risk as part of the tradition. Yet tradition does not absolve responsibility, especially within a school context. The first task tested bravery against a dragon, a clear and visible threat. The second task tested empathy under uncertainty, a far more insidious challenge. The lack of disclosure did not increase difficulty in a fair way, it shifted the burden from skill to emotional endurance. The book subtly critiques this choice through aftermath rather than condemnation. When the hostages awaken, they are told they were safe all along, and the relief is immediate but tinged with anger. The narration notes embarrassment and confusion, emotions that suggest a breach rather than a lesson learned. The champions are praised, points are awarded, yet no one addresses the ethical discomfort left behind. Silence becomes complicity. Number 17, sharing clues, was apparently fine. The strange logic of the Triwizard tournament becomes most apparent the moment Harry Potter learns about the Hungarian horn tail. The rule that tasks must remain secret exists to test adaptability, magical instinct, and courage under pressure. Yet when Hagrid reveals the dragons to Harry, the breach of secrecy is dismissed as harmless eccentricity. Harry then passes this privileged information to Cedric Diggory, believing it the honourable thing to do. The surprising part is not the revelation itself, but the world that allows it to pass as virtue rather than rule-breaking. The tournament, introduced as a highly regulated and dangerous international competition, suddenly appears porous, inconsistent, and vulnerable to favoritism. The contradiction grows clearer when one remembers how often the organisers emphasised unpredictability. Ludo Bagman delighted in theatrics, insisting that champions confront genuine surprises. The official statement that tasks must remain secret served as reassurance to spectators and staff that the event was unbiased. Yet moments after Harry receives insider knowledge, the supposed secrecy unravels. The Horntail, one of the most dangerous dragons in existence, becomes a topic traded between students like ordinary gossip. Harry's decision to tell Cedric is celebrated by Dumbledore with a remark about fairness, and the praise becomes an implicit endorsement of sharing classified information. The rule, once framed as essential, dissolves into a vague moral suggestion. Cedric's reaction highlights the inconsistency even further. When Harry discreetly warns him by the edge of the Forbidden Forest, Cedric appears surprised but accepts the information without concern for protocol. The book describes him blinking in astonishment as Harry reveals the truth about the dragons. Cedric's acceptance shows how poorly enforced the secrecy rules are. If breaking them were genuinely punishable, the Hufflepuff champion would have rejected the hint immediately. Instead, Cedric later reciprocates with his own guidance about the golden egg, implying that rule-breaking has quietly become part of the game. The tournament begins to resemble a covert exchange of favours rather than a level playing field. The deeper issue arises when one examines the purpose behind secrecy. The Triwizard tournament was revived only after decades of dormancy due to repeated deaths. The Ministry, represented by Barty Crouch Sr., insisted that strict regulations would protect students. Yet a loophole emerges. While champions must not be told the tasks by officials, there appears to be no explicit rule forbidding students from sharing information with one another. This oversight creates a paradox. If secrecy is crucial to safety, then sharing knowledge undermines that safety. If secrecy is not crucial, then the pretense of surprising tasks becomes little more than theatrical flair aimed at the audience. An example from the book illustrates this contradiction vividly. When Harry sees Victor Crumb practicing the summoning charm in preparation for the first task, the reasoning becomes clear. Champions are expected to prepare blindly, honing broad magical skills. The idea is to prevent them from training for task-specific advantages. But Harry, uniquely aware of the dragons, practices the charm with direct purpose. Knowing that he will need his firebolt creates a targeted training edge. Cedric, though informed afterward, also gains such an advantage. The fairness of the task has already been compromised long before a single dragon roars onto the field. A troubling ethical inconsistency emerges when Dumbledore himself praises Harry's act of sharing the information. The moment stands out because Dumbledore, far more than Bagman or Karkaroff, values the integrity of magical institutions. Yet his commendation shifts the framework from rule-based regulation to moral evaluation. Cedric is painted as deserving of Harry's help because he is honest and kind. But the tournament is not supposed to operate on subjective morality. It is governed by rules intended to protect lives. When the highest authority signals that emotional fairness outweighs established guidelines, the rules cease to serve their original purpose. The narrative suggests that the organizers rely on a mixture of tradition and assumption rather than consistent logic. The Triwizard tournament embodies centuries of ritual, and the staff appears to believe the rules have survived unchanged because participants historically honored them without question. But Hogwarts, at the time of the fourth tournament, contains students with varied loyalties, magical abilities, and ambitions. Hagrid's reckless revelation, though done out of affection for Harry, exposes how fragile the rules truly are. The staff never anticipated that personal relationships might override official protocol. In that sense, the system collapses under its own naivete. One could argue that the real reason Harry goes unpunished is political convenience. The Goblet of Fire forced him into the tournament, creating a legal complication. The Ministry wanted no further controversy surrounding his participation. Calling attention to Harry receiving insider information would have required a public reprimand or an adjustment to the scores. Moreover, Cedric's knowledge of the dragons would have made punishment uneven. Instead, the simplest option was to ignore the issue entirely. Institutional silence becomes a tool for maintaining the illusion of order. This institutional silence contradicts the gravity of the tournament's stakes. Young wizards face lethal creatures, hostile environments, and dark enchantments. When Harry confronts the Horntail, he nearly dies. Fleur Delacour is mauled by Grindylows. Victor Krum is magically manipulated into harming Cedric. The final task leads directly to Lord Voldemort's resurrection. In light of such dangers, the fact that sharing insider knowledge is not clearly forbidden reads like a dangerous oversight. Safety depends on structure, and structure depends on rules. Rules left ambiguous lead to unpredictable outcomes. The ambiguity also creates an unintended hierarchy among champions. Harry, because of his relationships with Hagrid and Moody, receives more unsolicited information than others. Cedric benefits indirectly due to Harry's integrity. Krum and Fleur, lacking similar connections within Hogwarts, are disadvantaged by circumstance rather than skill. The tournament, advertised as a test of personal merit, becomes skewed by interpersonal dynamics. The absence of explicit policies regarding shared knowledge transforms the contest into a reflection of social networks rather than magical ability. There is also a narrative contradiction revealed through the golden egg. In the second task, Cedric repays Harry by offering a hint cloaked in riddling subtlety. He suggests taking the egg into water, noting that the solution becomes clearer when submerged. Though presented poetically, this is as much insider assistance as Harry's warning about dragons. Rowling writes that Cedric gave the advice with an earnest sense of balance, highlighting the informal code that has developed between the champions. But this mutual exchange underscores the flaw. The tournament no longer tests individual problem-solving, it tests the quality of alliances made along the way. The nature of the hints offered further complicates the issue. Harry's clue to Cedric is explicit and precise, while Cedric's hint is cryptic. The imbalance in information quality could have affected the scores. If Harry had interpreted Cedric's clue incorrectly, his failure would not have reflected magical skill but uneven guidance. A regulated competition should not allow such variables to influence its outcomes. Yet because the staff neglects to address the exchange, the imbalance persists unchecked. A small but telling example arises during the third task briefing. Dumbledore informs the champions that the maze will contain magical obstacles, but declines to specify what they are. The secrecy here is absolute. Even Hagrid does not reveal anything in advance. The champions enter the maze blind as intended. The inconsistency becomes glaring. If the third task requires strict secrecy for fairness, why did the first task not receive the same consideration? The tournament's internal logic shifts without explanation, as though each task operates under its own, unwritten interpretation of the rules. Harry's experience with the dragons demonstrates how secrecy might have protected him had it been enforced. The exhilaration he feels when flying against the Horntail is described with raw intensity, but the moment also reveals that prior warning reduced his fear. Facing a dragon without preparation is terrifying but equalizing. Having foreknowledge transforms the confrontation into a planned maneuver. That emotional shift may have saved his life, but it also undermined the spirit of the tradition. Safety was improved, fairness diminished, and the rules blurred beyond recognition. In the end, the tournament's greatest illogic lies in its failure to define what truly matters, secrecy or sportsmanship. The event presents secrecy as essential but rewards Harry for ignoring it. It frames insider knowledge as dangerous, yet allows champions to share it freely. The organizers promote equality but overlook structural imbalances. Harry's act of warning Cedric emerges not as a breach of the rules, but as a revelation of how flimsy those rules truly are. The praise he receives reflects the moral compass of the characters, not the intentions of the tournament. The contradictions leave readers wondering whether the Triwizard tournament was ever meant to be fair, or whether fairness was merely another illusion conjured for the audience, as fragile as the golden eggs song above the surface of the Black Lake. Number 18, Real Moody, locked in a trunk for months. The strange quiet surrounding the fate of the real Alastor Moody remains one of the most unsettling narrative shadows cast by the Triwizard tournament. All year long, Hogwarts bustled with suspicion, whispers, and magical alarms, yet no one seemed disturbed by the presence of a massive, heavily locked trunk in the office of a man already known for paranoia. "Constant vigilance," Moody growled in the pages of Goblet of Fire, and the faculty treated this as a quirk rather than a signal that his quarters might hide darker truths. The trunk stood in plain sight, bristling with enchantments, and still nobody asked why a newly hired professor required 7 locks to guard it. The power of such complacency becomes awe. The more alarming, when one considers that the real Moody, Auror member, Dumbledore's trusted ally, lay imprisoned mere feet away from every lesson. The disregard shown by the Hogwarts staff seems even less believable when remembering that many professors had known Moody personally for decades. Minerva McGonagall, for example, had worked alongside him during several major investigations at the Ministry. She would have recognized instantly the signs of confinement magic or the unmistakable hum of a living presence hidden in a room. In fact, the books routinely describe how trained witches and wizards can sense enchantments the way one senses heat from a fire. That no one noticed that something alive was beneath the floorboards, as the trunk's enchantments suggest, challenges the reader to consider whether the castle's faculty were overly confident or unnervingly incurious. Even Dumbledore provides an example of this curious oversight. In Goblet of Fire, he visits the fake Moody more often than the text explicitly records, making it unlikely that he did not stand within arm's reach of the trunk housing a starved, imprisoned ally. While Dumbledore is often framed as omniscient, his own words betray his miscalculations. "I make mistakes like the next man," he says in the book, "only my mistakes tend to be bigger." Few mistakes could be bigger than failing to notice the disappearance of Alastor Moody, particularly during a year when Harry's life was openly threatened by dark forces. The greatest wizard of the age walked through that office repeatedly, and not once did he unseal a conspicuous humming trunk that practically announced its abnormality. The situation becomes even more troubling when one considers the magical tools readily available for detecting concealed life or dark enchantment. The Ministry uses spells such as Hominum Revelio to locate hidden humans, and even fifth-year students are capable of learning detection charms powerful enough to reveal invisible individuals. Auras trained Moody's own colleagues in methods of identifying prisoners concealed under glamour or lock. A trunk strengthened with a few protective enchantments should not have defeated the collective expertise of Hogwarts's staff. The absence of even one teacher casually casting a revealing charm in the office of a notoriously eccentric professor strains the logic of a world known for magical caution. Another layer of contradiction emerges when examining Moody's reputation. The real Moody's distrust of others was legendary, so widely known that even students like Dean Thomas joked about the aura's habit of setting traps for his dustbins. If anyone at Hogwarts were expected to scrutinize Moody, it was Severus Snape, a man who recognized the rhythm of deception the way a musician recognizes a familiar melody. Snape, in fact, had several tense interactions with the impostor throughout the year, including the moment he accused Moody of raiding his private stores of boomslang skin and gillyweed. Yet Snape's sharp mind, so quick to detect plots, failed to perceive the far more alarming fact that Moody himself was missing. A potions master who brewed complicated draughts requiring exact sensory perception could surely have felt the magical disturbance of a living body hidden in the room. The seventh locked trunk itself presents the clearest contradiction. Students passed it during lessons. Visitors stood beside it while arguing over disciplinary matters. It was described as an object with a series of descending lids, each sealed by a different lock, leading to the bottom compartment where Moody lay shackled and weakened. This object was not subtle. Hogwarts is full of enchanted oddities, yet very few are associated with new staff members, and even fewer are kept in open view during instructional hours. Why no curious student secretly cast Alohomora, a charm children learn before arriving at Hogwarts, remains one of the greatest unanswered questions. The fake Moody relied entirely on luck and the assumption that the student's natural mischief would somehow lie dormant for the first time in school history. Adding to the implausibility is the known behavior of Fred and George Weasley. Throughout Goblet of Fire, the twins dedicate enormous time and creativity to probing magical boundaries, experimenting with new spells, and testing ways to cheat the tournament's age line. These are boys who brewed complex aging potions in secret and who later founded a joke shop built entirely on experimental enchantment. Their curiosity should have driven them to investigate the mysterious trunk, especially since Moody himself was involved in policing the school's pranks. If any students would have questioned why a professor kept a 7-locked container that emitted muffled noises, it would have been the Weasley twins. In addition, Hogwarts itself is a living magical structure saturated with enchantments that often reveal secrets whether one seeks them or not. The Marauder's map, for instance, shows every living person in the castle, no matter where they hide. Harry, Ron, and Hermione had direct access to this artifact during much of the school year. The map should have displayed the name Alastor Moody in a stationary position inside the trunk, while another Alastor Moody roamed the halls. Harry had used the map countless times to tail Draco Malfoy, avoid Snape, or track Pettigrew. That he never once glimpsed two Moodys on the parchment requires an explanation the books never provide. A magical object powerful enough to reveal an animagus rat should not have been fooled by a bound aura lying meters away from Harry himself. Moreover, house elves frequent every corner of Hogwarts, often performing tasks unnoticed by the human population. These creatures sense magic with a depth wizards rarely achieve. Winky, Dobby, and Creature demonstrate repeatedly that elves can perceive emotions, intentions, and presence without needing direct interaction. That not one elf raised alarm about an unconscious human locked inside a professor's trunk seems incompatible with their typical behavior. In Goblet of Fire, Winky becomes hysterical at merely sensing the dark mark. It is inconceivable that she or others would feel nothing when passing a prisoner slowly losing strength in a confined magical space. One particularly striking example that exposes the inconsistency involves the night Barty Crouch Sr. appeared on the castle grounds in a delirious state. Dumbledore, Snape, and Moody all responded to the mic. Emergency. While the impostor escorted Crouch away, Dumbledore instructed Snape to fetch Harry. The real Moody was, at that very moment, locked inside the trunk in the impostor's office. In a year defined by constant suspicion, no one questioned why the faux Moody insisted on acting alone during such a critical discovery. The mere fact that the tournament involved dangers serious enough to require dragons should have inspired more scrutiny of each staff member's behavior. The storytelling logic falters further when recalling the Imperious Curse lessons. Fake Moody cast the unforgivable curse upon students under Dumbledore's authorization. A professor suddenly comfortable displaying the darkest legal magic should have attracted immediate evaluation by other staff. For example, Professor Flitwick, a charms master, could have easily recognized discrepancies in casting style or wand work. The real Moody's magical signature would differ drastically from that of Barty Crouch Jr., especially during such advanced spells. Yet no teacher commented on feeling anything off about the demonstrations, despite how carefully wizards monitor unforgivable curses. Even more haunting is the prolonged isolation endured by the real Moody. The text confirms that he was weakened, dehydrated, and deprived of sunlight, surviving only through forced draughts of polyjuice potion used by his captor. He heard voices, footsteps, and entire lessons unfold above him. Hogwarts is portrayed as a place where portraits report unusual noises, staircases rearrange themselves, and suits of armor shout warnings. The castle reacts to suffering, mischief, and intrusion. And yet the silent, continuous distress of an imprisoned aura evoked no magical response from the building itself. This detail makes the concealment seem almost magically improbable. One cannot ignore the chilling specificity of the trunk's design: 7 locks, each opening to a progressively deeper compartment. The bottom chamber, where the real Moody was held, was described as a rough wooden cell. A piece of furniture this elaborate, created solely for illegal imprisonment, should have thrummed with dark intent, detectable by any skilled wizard. Dumbledore has previously identified cursed objects instantly, such as the opal necklace in Half-Blood Prince. It strains belief that he failed to sense the layered enchantments meant to suppress a grown wizard. The most compelling evidence that this plot point defies logic appears after the impostor is finally unmasked. Dumbledore opens the trunk effortlessly and confirms Moody's presence without shock that such an object sat untouched for months. He simply remarks, "He's very weak," as though the discovery answers a long-suspected question. Yet the narrative never acknowledges why this suspicion did not manifest earlier. For a man who took the trouble to test Harry's wand after a momentary disturbance at the Quidditch World Cup, it is inconsistent for Dumbledore to show no earlier concern about an aura's unexplained reclusiveness. Ultimately, the trunk stands as a symbol of overlooked danger during a year defined by vigilance. Its presence challenges the internal logic of the magical world, a world in which spells exist specifically to detect deception and locate missing people. If Hogwarts staff, portraits, ghosts, house elves, enchanted objects, and curious students all coexisted within meters of a kidnapped wizard, yet none discovered him, one is left with an inescapable conclusion. The tournament's greatest illusion was not Barty Crouch Jr.'s polyjuice disguise, but the collective failure of an entire castle to question the simplest, most suspicious object in plain view. Number 19. Why was the goblet a portkey? The Triwizard Cup stands in the center of the Hogwarts maze like a promise carved from silver. Victory, honor, and the end of a deadly competition. Yet beneath its polished surface lies one of the most illogical narrative gaps in the entire history of magical tournaments. The cup is proudly displayed before hundreds of students and professors, yet no one imagines that it might be anything more than a gleaming trophy. And still, by the time Harry Potter touches it, it has transformed into a portkey, the very mechanism that delivers him into the hands of Lord Voldemort. The transformation from symbol of triumph to trap of death raises questions not only about magical security but about the astonishing inattentiveness of the tournament's organizers. The cup's enchanting as a portkey implies deliberate sabotage, but this only deepens the mystery. A portkey is not a casual enchantment. It is a powerful charm requiring precision and authorization. Amelia Bones once remarked within the Ministry that unauthorized portkey creation is a serious violation of magical transportation laws, and the cup was unquestionably unauthorized. This means someone managed to enchant the most visible object in the entire competition without a single witch or wizard performing the standard Ministry checks. That oversight becomes baffling when compared to the earlier hysteria over the Goblet of Fire, which was surrounded by age lines and restrictions, guarded like a sacred relic. If the organizers were so meticulous about who entered the competition, why did they abandon all scrutiny when it came to the object that would end the competition? It becomes even stranger when recalling that the cup was placed within the maze only hours before the champions entered it. This timing suggests two possibilities. Either the cup was enchanted long beforehand and everyone failed to notice, or it was modified at the last possible moment, when security should have been at its highest. Both answers appear equally unreasonable. In a world where even school brooms are checked for jinxes before a Quidditch match, no one examines a legendary magical trophy. Moody, really, Barty Crouch Jr., was present at nearly every stage of preparation, but even he could not have risked casting a portkey charm under the eyes of the staff without suspicion. Unless, of course, the staff were not looking at all. The maze itself was described in the book as alive with enchantments, its hedges pulsing with charms that responded to the thoughts and movements of the champions. It is inexplicable that the cup, sitting at its core, did not receive the same level of scrutiny. Professor McGonagall had personally supervised the maze's safety checks, yet the trophy, which represented the final moment of the entire Triwizard event, seemed to fall completely outside anyone's concern. The narrative describes it as gleaming in the center of the clearing, as though waiting patiently, a line that subtly underscores the eerie normalcy everyone accepted. The cup was simply assumed to be safe because it was the cup. Barty Crouch Jr.'s involvement explains part of the mystery, but not all. Even impersonating Mad-Eye Moody, he should not have been able to alter a celebrated magical artifact without triggering detection spells. Dumbledore kept protective enchantments around Hogwarts that were sensitive enough to detect transfigured intruders, concealed curses, and even changes in magical energy. When Harry later touches the cup and feels the jerk behind his navel, it signifies a very active magical effect. How did this active charm remain dormant and invisible to the world's most talented headmaster? Readers often overlook that Dumbledore had once uncovered the enchantments on the cursed ring of the Gaunts, yet here he sees nothing on a trophy placed under his own surveillance. Specific examples from the tournament underline the inconsistency. When dragons were brought in for the first task, Charlie Weasley and dozens of handlers inspected each creature repeatedly. The second task involved the Ministry's Department of Magical Law Enforcement ensuring that the underwater hostages were safe. Hermione later remarks that security was tighter than ever. Yet for the final task, the grand prize itself, an object that every champion would physically touch, was allowed to remain magically unchecked. As though the danger of the first two tasks exhausted all caution, leaving the final phase inexplicably neglected. Even the precedent of previous Triwizard tournaments contradicts such negligence. Historical accounts of earlier cups describe layers of enchantments to prevent cheating, tampering, or magical interference. One 18th-century commentator wrote that the cup was inspected by 3 impartial enchanters before the final round began, a tradition meant to reassure participants and prevent precisely the kind of disaster that later unfolded. Hogwarts supposedly reviving the event with utmost respect for tradition, inexplicably ignored one of its most important safeguards. This contradiction is perhaps the most significant indictment of the organizers' oversight. Some fans argue that only Crouch Jr., using Moody's authority, could have bypassed inspection. But this raises another problem. Crouch Jr. was one man, and the cup was positioned in a public tournament prepared by multiple departments. For him to alter the cup, he would have needed isolation, time, and the absence of magical interference. Portkeys glow faintly during enchantment. They hum. They radiate unstable magical signatures until they settle. These signs would be obvious to any experienced witch or wizard walking past. That no one noticed is an improbability bordering on narrative convenience rather than in-world logic. A critical detail appears in the book when Dumbledore later says the cup was a portkey. He offers no explanation for why it was not detected earlier. This absence of explanation has led many readers to suspect that Rowling intentionally left a gap for dramatic impact, but within the logic of the magical universe, the oversight is staggering. Hogwarts hosts the world's most dangerous inter-school competition in decades, yet no committee, no official, no security expert thinks to examine the winning artifact. It is like placing the sword of Gryffindor in the Great Hall and assuming no dark wizard would ever attempt to tamper with it. The illogic grows when one considers the cup's placement. It was positioned at the maze's center long before the champions reached it. The staff had hours, if not longer, to walk through the maze pathways and inspect the final clearing. Hagrid, who escorted Harry into the maze earlier, was notoriously sensitive to magical tampering. He identified hexed creatures and jinxed plants instinctively. How, then, did he fail to notice anything unusual surrounding the cup? This suggests either that no one approached the cup, which is irresponsible, or that everyone approached it and still perceived nothing, which is implausible. Portkeys must be assigned a destination. This means that whoever enchanted the cup had to designate the graveyard of Little Hangleton as its target. Such a setting was infused with dark magic. Voldemort had once described it as a place charged with old power. A portkey pointing to such a location should have triggered magical alerts, especially within Hogwarts, where protective enchantments registered dangerous magic. But no such warnings occurred. It implies either that Hogwarts security was shockingly weak, or that the narrative temporarily forgot its own established rules. Crouch Jr. did manipulate several elements of the tournament without detection. He confounded the Goblet of Fire, he undermined champions during the tasks, and he subtly directed Harry toward victory. These feats demonstrate cunning, but they do not excuse the logical gap around the cup. The goblet, at least, was surrounded by ancient enchantments that might have obscured tampering. The cup, by contrast, stood in an open field. It was exposed, unguarded, untested. The book describes Harry seeing it illuminated by the moon, perfectly still, gleaming with cold light. A stillness that becomes symbolic. No one examined it, because no one imagined danger would come from the object, meant to symbolize triumph. Some interpretations attempt to justify the lapse by claiming that everyone trusted the cup because it had been safe for centuries. But this contradicts the heightened climate of fear surrounding Voldemort's rumored return. Throughout the book, witches and wizards express anxiety about dark forces. The Ministry is described as stretching its resources thin. Dumbledore, too, senses that something sinister is approaching. Trusting blind tradition during such a period is not just naive, it is contrary to the behavior of every protective, cautious adult in the narrative. The moment Harry and Cedric touch the cup, the truth of the enchantment reveals itself with brutal simplicity. It was a portkey, Harry thinks as he feels the familiar pull. The shock of that moment is powerful, but it also underscores the failure of everyone who allowed this outcome. The cup was not inspected, the cup was not tested, the cup was not guarded. The cup became the perfect vessel for a murder plot, not because Voldemort was invincible, but because the organizers abandoned their vigilance. This failure becomes even more vivid when contrasted with the aftermath. After Harry returns with Cedric's body, Dumbledore instantly identifies the enchantment as though recognizing an obvious signature. This retroactively strengthens the argument that the portkey charm should have been detected earlier. Dumbledore could sense traces of Voldemort's magic on Quirrell. He could interpret magical echoes within memories. He could identify cursed objects from centuries past. That he did not sense a portkey charm in his own tournament is not a reflection of Dumbledore's weakness, but of the narrative choosing suspense over consistency. In the end, the Triwizard Cup's transformation into a portkey remains an unforgettable moment in the story, but also one of its most illogical. It required the perfect storm of inattentive organizers, absent security measures, unquestioned assumptions, and a surprising disregard for magical protocol. A powerful enchantment was hiding in plain sight, shining under the moonlight, waiting patiently for the champions, and not a single witch or wizard, not even the greatest headmaster of the age, thought to ask the most basic question: what if someone tampered with the cup? Number 20. How did Harry and Cedric arrive at the same time? The moment Harry Potter and Cedric Diggory touched the Triwizard Cup at the same time has long troubled attentive readers. The rules of the third task clearly stated that champions entered the maze one by one, separated by measured intervals to avoid interference. Yet the story unfolds in a way that allows two competitors, who should have been minutes apart, to arrive at the heart of the labyrinth simultaneously. Even Professor Minerva McGonagall emphasized earlier, during the weighing of wands, that the tournament structure demanded fairness through regulated timing. The absence of such precision in the maze becomes one of the most puzzling contradictions surrounding the event. The Triwizard Tournament, designed to test courage, intelligence, and magical skill, depended on carefully crafted systems. Ludo Bagman announces to the crowd just before the third task that the champions will enter in order of their points, with Harry beginning first, followed by Cedric, then Victor Crumb, and lastly, Fleur Delacour. This staggered entrance was not ceremonial, it was the foundation of the task's intent. A maze hides far more potential for chaos than a dragon or a lake, and any sensible magical authority would tighten control, not loosen it. Yet the narrative portrays the maze as a semi-sentient creation, reshaping itself without oversight, acting more like an organic creature than a controlled environment. One specific example highlights this contradiction. Bagman tells Harry during one of their private meetings, "You'll go into the maze first, Potter. The others will follow at intervals of 2 minutes." If Harry truly entered first, this should have created a measurable advantage. Even with magical obstacles shifting at unpredictable moments, Cedric should have trailed behind, encountering different configurations at different times. Yet when readers examine the sequence of events, the timing collapses. Cedric not only catches up to Harry, he reaches the cup at the exact same moment, a scenario that undermines the established structure of staggered starts. Even more curious is that none of the Hogwarts staff appears concerned about monitoring the maze's interior. When Harry faced the Hungarian Horntail, the audience watched every move. During the Black Lake Challenge, merpeople and observers tracked swimmers with careful attention. But when the champions entered the maze, the teachers and the ministry surrendered control entirely. The book states simply, the maze closed behind Harry, sealing him in darkness, giving the unsettling impression that once inside, champions vanished from oversight. How could such a prestigious event lose all accountability precisely when danger was greatest? The logical gap widens when considering the tournament's violent history. The Triwizard tournament had been suspended for centuries precisely because students died. Dumbledore himself acknowledges this when introducing the competition, yet in the final task, the maze receives no magical marks for tracking progress, no enchanted timers updating locations, and no guardian spells to verify fairness. A single professor, Hagrid, helped design the hedges, but this speaks to construction, not safety. The magical community that invented the sneakerscope, the faux glass, and the Marauders map surely possessed the capability to monitor 4 teenagers wandering through a trap-filled labyrinth. A comparison with earlier tasks reveals stark inconsistencies. In the second task, the champions were given a magical hourglass and a clear rule. They had 60 minutes to retrieve what was taken from them. Not only that, the lake was surrounded by observers and patrolled by merpeople sworn to enforce safety. In contrast, the maze relinquished structure entirely. Even the Sphinx, a highly intelligent creature that obstructed Harry, admits that her presence is part of the tournament's design, but intelligent creatures do not substitute for objective regulation. Nothing in the maze ensures that the staggered start remains meaningful. The lack of monitoring becomes especially questionable when Victor Crumb, under the Imperious Curse, attacks Cedric Diggory. Cedric later tells Harry in a strained voice that Crumb was trying to stun me. This means the maze allowed criminal activity to remain completely hidden until discovered by a fellow competitor. No one observing from outside sensed a magical disturbance, no alarms sounded, and no enchanted barriers neutralized illegal curses. Considering Barty Crouch Jr.'s infiltration of Hogwarts, such negligence becomes even more alarming. Another revealing moment occurs when Harry, after surviving the blast-ended Scroots and the Sphinx, spots the Triwizard Cup glowing ahead of him. The narration notes that he and Cedric were running side by side, even though Cedric should have been delayed by multiple minutes. Harry had stopped to help Fleur. Delacour earlier when he found her unconscious, which should have further altered the timing. Instead, these delays vanish, and Cedric reappears as if the maze rearranged causality itself. The result feels less like a competitive task and more like a narrative convenience, an emotional setup for the shared victory that turns into tragedy. What makes the moment more perplexing is that the Ministry of Magic prides itself on regulation. Bartemius Crouch Sr., even at the height of his collapse, insists that every rule must be upheld. Yet his own son, disguised as Mad-Eye Moody, manipulates the tournament without raising suspicion. This exposes a deeper flaw. The maze, unlike previous tasks, provides the perfect cover for wrongdoing because no one is watching. Its construction, high hedges, shifting paths, independence from external spells, renders oversight all but impossible. If Dumbledore intended fairness, the maze contradicted his intentions. The quote describing the final moments before Harry and Cedric reached the cup reveals even more. They were both sprinting now, and the cup was gleaming ahead. There is no indication of staggered timing influencing the outcome. The text treats them as though they began together, nullifying the logic that should have shaped the task. If the maze moved obstacles specifically to equalize their positions, then the maze functioned not as a test, but as a manipulator of destiny. In such a case, victory becomes arbitrary. Another overlooked issue is that the cup itself was transformed into a portkey. A portkey of that magnitude should have required ministry authorization, especially inside a regulated tournament. Yet no one tested the cup before declaring it the prize. Had magical markers been placed on the champions, officials would have noticed the moment Harry and Cedric vanished from the maze entirely. Instead, their disappearance goes undetected until Harry's limp body appears, carrying Cedric's corpse. The lack of immediate realization shows that no magical trackers existed. Readers who compare this to the Marauder's map might wonder why Dumbledore did not employ a similar tool. Hogwarts already possessed an artifact capable of showing the location of every student and guest within its grounds. If 4 schoolboys were able to create such a map, the faculty overseeing an international tournament surely could have used equivalent magic. Yet nothing of the sort is mentioned. This omission makes the maze feel less like an official test and more like an unpredictable wilderness where anything could occur without witnesses. A particularly striking piece of evidence is the absence of timing commentary during the event. In the first task, Bagman narrated every movement enthusiastically. During the second task, he updated the audience on swimmers' positions. But during the third task, the narration falls silent after the hedges close. No enchanted scoreboard shows progress, no commentary evaluates speed or skill. An event designed for spectators becomes an event in which the spectators know nothing. The tournament ceases to function as a competition and becomes merely an enclosed drama. Even the victory moment reflects this lack of system. Cedric, exhausted and wounded from Crumb's attack, manages to sprint beside Harry with extraordinary synchronicity. Their final coordination is emotionally powerful but logically implausible. If Cedric entered 2 minutes later, if he fought a bewitched opponent, if he navigated different obstacles, and if Harry stopped to help Fleur and later Cedric himself, then symmetry becomes impossible. Their joint arrival at the cup contradicts every variable the task introduced. The most telling indication that the maze lacked regulation comes after Harry returns from the graveyard. The book describes pandemonium among the teachers as they realize what has happened. There is no mention that anyone noticed the precise moment the boys vanished, no reference to a magical alert that should have triggered when a portkey activated unexpectedly. The officials do not discuss timings or entry intervals, they simply react to catastrophe. This silence confirms that the maze operated without logical or magical oversight. The Triwizard tournament, celebrated for centuries as the pinnacle of magical competition, reveals through this moment a structural flaw that contradicts its own ideals. The staggered entry into the maze suggests fairness, yet the ending contradicts it. The lack of tracking suggests danger, yet none of the staff acknowledge it. The shared arrival at the cup becomes symbolic not only of Cedric's integrity and Harry's bravery, but also of a deeply inconsistent system, a system whose failure allowed Voldemort to return. Number 21, a dead student returns. And that's it? The moment Harry returned from the maze, clutching Cedric Diggory's lifeless body, stands in the canon like an unhealed wound. Spectators erupted in screams, yet the adults, the very people responsible for safeguarding the champions, behaved with a stillness bordering on paralysis. The boy who had vanished alongside Cedric reappeared in a swirl of blue light, injured, trembling, incoherent, and dragging a corpse. Any competition governed by rules, especially one boasting the involvement of ministries from 3 countries, would have had a cascade of emergency protocols. Instead, Hogwarts watched chaos bloom without anyone seizing control, even the judges, renowned witches and wizards such as Ludo Bagman, Barty Crouch Sr., before his disappearance. And Madame Maxime seemed swallowed by shock, allowing minutes to pass before Dumbledore alone acted. Those minutes tell a story of systemic failure. In a world that prides itself on magical detection, the absence of investigative spells is the most disquieting. Experienced wizards like Alastor Moody carried entire arsenals of analytical magic. The ministry itself often employed Priori Tractus, Hermanum Revelio, and even specialized curse residue spells during serious incidents. Yet when Cedric's body arrived, there was no summoning of magical forensic teams, no shimmering webs of detection magic thrown across the scene, no immediate closure of the area. Cedric lay exposed on the grass, untouched by diagnostic charms, as if he were not evidence of a crime, but an unfortunate accident. The ministry later attempted to brand this moment as a tragic mishap of tournament difficulty, a position so fragile it collapses under the slightest examination. The behavior of Cornelius Fudge becomes critical in this puzzle. His reaction is remembered mainly for denial, but long before he rejected Harry's description of Voldemort's return, he made an even stranger choice, neglecting the responsibility of crisis containment. A dead Hogwarts champion meant international scandal. The leaders of Beauxbatons and Durmstrang, standing only yards away, had every right to demand answers. Yet Fudge avoided decisive action, refusing even the simplest measures, such as isolating the crime scene. He did not order the examination of Cedric's body for spell residue. He did not request verite serum-based questioning, although such measures were common practice in ministry investigations. The silence that followed Harry's return echoes louder than any denial Fudge later voiced. One of the strangest details is the unused potential of the Triwizard Cup itself. As a portkey, the cup records magical imprints when tampered with. Arthur Weasley once explained that illegal portkeys often retain traces of the last enchantment placed upon them. Dumbledore, knowledgeable enough to recognize the cup had been transformed into a 2-way trap, should have demanded its immediate containment. Yet nobody confiscated the cup at once. Nobody placed it under stasis or requested the Department of Magical Transportation to extract its imprint. The cup sat in the grass, still glowing faintly from its recent activation. While Cedric's death demanded answers, the officials made no move to pursue. Even more unsettling is the complete disregard for Harry's condition. The boy's clothes were torn, blood streaked his face, his hands trembled uncontrollably. The book describes him as shaking so violently he could not speak. Yet no healer stepped forward with diagnostic spells such as Anatomicus Revelare or mind-stabilizing charms that St. Mungo's would normally administer after any magical trauma. Madame Pomfrey, famous for never hesitating to intervene, did not rush to the scene until far later. The implication is that everyone present fixated on the spectacle instead of the response. An injured minor returning from an unknown destination, one linked to black magic, should have triggered emergency containment. Instead, Harry became a public witness in the most vulnerable state imaginable. Sirius Black, though nearby in his animagus form, remained hidden, unable to act officially. The ministry, fully aware of Sirius's loyalty to Harry, ignored the emotional significance of the moment. If protocol had been followed, Harry would have been placed under protective observation in a ministry-secured area. His testimony should have been taken in a sealed room with experts in trauma-related magical memory. Instead, he was swarmed by teachers, classmates, and officials demanding fragmented explanations. The violation of investigative structure is so profound that it feels intentional, as if those in power preferred confusion over clarity. The reaction of the crowd also reveals a deeper illogic. Hundreds of spectators had spent the evening cheering for teenagers engaged in deadly tasks, yet none seemed shocked enough to question why the final challenge, which was supposed to require strategic spellwork and bravery, resulted in the sudden appearance of a corpse. The Triwizard tournament was resurrected under the promise of improved safety. That promise disintegrated the moment Cedric's empty eyes stared into the night sky. Parents of Hogwarts students, foreign delegates, and ministry representatives did not demand immediate explanations. Their inertia cannot be attributed solely to fear. It reflects a culture conditioned to trust authority even when authority falters. When considering examples from earlier books, the contrast becomes even sharper. When the Chamber of Secrets was opened, Hogwarts underwent intense scrutiny. Students were sequestered, teachers were interrogated, magical creatures were tracked and examined. Yet the death of a student in a ministry-sanctioned tournament saw none of these measures. Harry's return should have triggered lockdown-level protocols similar to those used when Sirius allegedly infiltrated the castle in Harry's third year. Instead, the grounds remained open, the cup remained untouched, and Cedric's body remained unprotected from magical contamination. A line from the book deepens the inconsistency. Cedric Diggory was lying on the ground beside him. He was dead. That stark description is not merely narrative, it is a cry for procedural action. Even Muggle police would have cordoned off the field, photographed the area, questioned witnesses, and gathered evidence. The wizarding world, with far more sophisticated investigative magic, did none of this. Not a single enchantment was cast to stabilize the scene. Not a single official declared the tournament suspended pending inquiry. The rapid descent into chaos left Cedric's death unframed by logic or responsibility. The Ministry's decision to treat the incident as a misunderstanding highlights its deeper motives. Every adult present witnessed the terror in Harry's eyes. They heard him utter the name many had spent years avoiding. His first words contained the truth the Ministry refused to face. Voldemort had returned. Accepting that truth required acknowledging that the Ministry had failed to detect rising dark magic, failed to protect its youth, and failed to secure one of the most public international events in recent wizarding history. Rather than shoulder accountability, officials elected silence. Silencing Harry served political convenience rather than public safety. This flaw is underscored when one considers Dumbledore's immediate emotional shift. He alone recognized the severity of what had occurred. He recognized the wand Cedric never raised in self-defense. He recognized the wounds carved into Harry's skin. His face, described as ancient and sorrowful, signaled understanding long before hearing Harry's full account. Yet even he did not unleash the full investigative might he possessed. Dumbledore knew spells capable of resurrecting memories from objects, isolating magical signatures, and unraveling enchantments. His restraint, intentional or not, allowed the Ministry's narrative to take root before truth could anchor itself. The failure to question Hogwarts' own security measures also fragments the logic of the moment. Barty Crouch Jr., disguised as Alastair Moody, manipulated the entire tournament under the staff's noses. Once Harry returned alone, frantic and broken, the possibility of sabotage should have become immediately obvious. A school already infiltrated by a Death Eater during Voldemort's absence should have assumed the worst upon the appearance of a dead student. Instead, the teachers, exhausted from weeks of tension, seemed suspended between grief and disbelief, rendering them incapable of decisive action. The most chilling implication becomes clear when examining Cedric's symbolic role. He represented fairness, talent, integrity, and the pride of Hufflepuff House. His death was not simply a personal tragedy, but an attack on what the tournament claimed to celebrate. Yet even his parents were not brought forward for magical truth-seeking, no empathic spells to reconstruct Cedric's last moments, no pensive assisted analysis of the residual magic clinging to his skin. Amos Diggory's devastation remained private grief rather than a catalyst for public justice, and that failure speaks to a broader cultural aversion to confronting uncomfortable truths. Harry's mental state after returning also demands scrutiny. He repeatedly murmured, "He's back," a phrase loaded with historical weight. The trauma he carried was so intense that even recounting it caused him to tremble uncontrollably. Yet the adults surrounding him treated his claim as a political inconvenience rather than a critical lead. Harry's condition should have qualified him as a high-risk witness requiring stabilization and structured debriefing. Instead, he became a target of disbelief and suspicion. This negligent handling allowed misinformation to spread faster than truth. The illogical stillness of the scene becomes most apparent when recalling the spell that killed Cedric. A flash of green light, and he was dead. Killing curses leave magical traces. They linger in the air like cold fingerprints. Had investigators performed even rudimentary detection spells around Cedric's body, they would have found the irrefutable signature of Avada Kedavra. But the Ministry, desperate to avoid acknowledging any sign of rising darkness, never pursued verification. Their refusal to interrogate the evidence ensured that Cedric's death remained politically manageable. The aftermath of the event proves that the system was not merely unprepared, it was unwilling. Hogwarts was left vulnerable, its students traumatized, its headmaster threatened, and its truth denied. Harry's return with Cedric's body crystallizes a question the wizarding world was too afraid to ask. How many adults, when faced with the return of evil, chose silence over courage? The illogical inaction surrounding that night reveals not only a flaw in procedure, but a flaw in character. And that flaw, more than any dark spell or rising threat, is what allowed Voldemort's return to take root in the shadows of denial. Number 22, Voldemort's return. All the red flags were there. The events of the Triwizard tournament unfolded under a sky already heavy with rumors, yet the wizarding world seemed determined to pretend the weather was still clear. The fear of Voldemort's return had never completely disappeared after the First Wizarding War, lingering like smoke in closed rooms. But when the strange incident with the Goblet of Fire happened, almost no adult wizard dared to speak the obvious. Harry Potter's name was drawn as a fourth champion in a competition built on ancient, unbreakable rules, and the room filled with shock. Still, the teachers and ministers alike rushed to rationalize the impossible. The moment should have been a spark for suspicion, but instead it was smothered by bureaucracy, pride, and fear. One of the most striking illogicalities lies in the unquestioned presence of Alastor Moody, a man who was widely known for his extreme caution and paranoia, suddenly behaving in ways distinctly out of character. Students whispered that he seemed wild even for the famous ex-aura. Teachers noticed his overbearing interest in Harry. Dumbledore saw him transform Draco Malfoy into a ferret right in the middle of the hallway, an action Moody would never have considered appropriate in his aura days. And yet no. One asked whether this was truly the same man who had spent decades preaching constant vigilance. Rowling writes, Moody's electric blue eye swiveled in its socket to fix on Harry, a detail repeatedly emphasized, but never once was it examined whether the man behind the eye was really Moody at all. The adults simply accepted the oddity because the world had taught them that eccentricity was sometimes easier to believe than conspiracy. Harry's forced entry into the tournament should have been the loudest alarm bell of all. A centuries-old artifact produced a result that contradicted the very magic that sustained it. Dumbledore questioned Harry, but even then treated the situation as an unfortunate anomaly rather than a strategic attack. The goblet had been fooled, but no one asked by whom and for what purpose. It was easier, perhaps, to assume that a mysterious magical glitch had occurred than to admit that someone with cunning and powerful abilities had infiltrated Hogwarts. This reluctance to acknowledge danger was itself a symptom of denial. As long as adults believed in their own safety, they could pretend Voldemort's threat had died with him. The strange disappearance of Barty Crouch Sr. added another piece to the puzzle, yet the Ministry and Hogwarts alike refused to place it on the board. Crouch had been a formidable political force, a man whose reputation was built on unwavering discipline. When he began sending letters full of confusion and contradictions, Percy Weasley noticed something was wrong. But Percy lacked influence, and those who had it ignored the warning completely. Then came the night when Harry encountered Crouch on the grounds, raving and terrified, trying desperately to warn Dumbledore. The book states he was gibbering, trembling, as though he were being tortured, but instead of sparking an immediate investigation, Cornelius Fudge dismissed the entire incident as madness. The Ministry preferred the comfort of denial over the discomfort of uncovering truth. Meanwhile, the strange chain of events during the tournament formed a pattern as clear as wandlight in the dark. Harry survived dragons, merpeople, and an enchanted maze, yet every task was manipulated in subtle ways. Someone had provided him the tools and information needed, not to help him win, but to ensure he reached the final. Cedric Diggory noticed the odd consistency of Harry's near failures turning into successes, but generously assumed it was luck, skill, or some combination of both. What Cedric did not see was the invisible hand guiding both of them closer to the graveyard. Adults, too, chalked it up to the unpredictable nature of magical competitions. No one asked why every twist conveniently nudged Harry along the exact path Voldemort needed. The adult wizard's failure to suspect Voldemort sooner was not due to lack of intelligence, but to psychological blindness. After years of peace, even Dumbledore's closest allies had grown comfortable. They did not want to believe that the nightmare of their youth was creeping back. Fudge especially clung to a carefully constructed notion of peace. His authority depended on stability, and Voldemort's return would shatter the illusion he had used to maintain control. It was easier for him to suspect Dumbledore of manipulation than to accept a dangerous truth. Rowling captures this rigid denial when she writes, "Fudge's voice trembled. He can't be back. He can't." His fear became the blockade that prevented investigation long before the graveyard confirmed the inevitable. Barty Crouch Jr., disguised as Moody, orchestrated the entire tournament like a puppet master playing with enchanted strings. The Polyjuice potion was an old trick, familiar to many, and yet no one thought to question the possibility that an impostor walked the corridors of Hogwarts. Snape, who knew the aroma of Polyjuice from personal experience, smelled suspicious behavior, but linked it only to Harry's wanderings, not to Moody's identity. McGonagall noticed Moody's excessive protectiveness over Harry, but interpreted it as professional concern. Even Dumbledore, usually perceptive to secrets, was blinded by the trust he placed in his old friend. It was a rare moment when his wisdom faltered, reminding readers that even great men suffer moments of vulnerability. The truth hid itself in plain sight when Moody repeatedly emphasized constant vigilance, a phrase that grew hollow coming from a man who was, ironically, the very threat Hogwarts needed to guard against. Students joked about his paranoia, but his unusual behavior, such as showing Harry how to resist the Imperius Curse, was treated as rough but valuable instruction. No one asked why a teacher would so urgently prepare Harry for mind control. Voldemort's return was the only context in which such lessons made sense. Yet without acknowledging the possibility, even the most obvious signs were dismissed as eccentric pedagogy. The death of Cedric Diggory shattered the illusion of safety, but the tragedy came only after a long series of ignored warnings. Cedric was the kind of student Hogwarts prided itself on: honorable, loyal, gifted. His murder in the graveyard was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of every overlooked oddity throughout the year. When Harry returned with Cedric's body, he cried, "He's back, Voldemort's back," a desperate truth that should have been anticipated by anyone capable of seeing patterns. The adults' shock in that moment was less a reaction to Voldemort than to the realization of their own blindness. One of the most overlooked details is how openly Voldemort's supporters moved during that year. Igor Karkaroff, a former Death Eater, grew increasingly frantic as the dark mark on his arm darkened. His fear was visible, his anxiety evident in every conversation he had with Snape. He even fled before the tournament ended. His behavior alone should have confirmed that something dark was rising. Instead, his actions were written off as personal cowardice. Once again, the adults preferred simplified explanations over uncomfortable truths. Even Rita Skeeter's articles, coated with sensationalism, contained fragmented truths buried beneath exaggeration. She wrote of Hogwarts being a place where mysteries brew and dangers simmer beneath the surface. While her reporting style aimed to scandalize rather than inform, her insinuations mirrored reality more than anyone wished to admit. Her gossip about Crouch's disappearance, Moody's strange conduct, and Harry's inexplicable tournament entry should have sparked inquiry from those in power. But adults dismissed her writing entirely, forgetting that misinformation often sprouts from real seeds. The broader Wizarding Society mirrored this negligence. Parents sent their children letters expressing worry, but none demanded that the ministry investigate the tournament's irregularities. The Daily Prophet printed cautious lines about unusual developments, but avoided suggesting conspiracy. Fear and disbelief softened the edges of suspicion. The community had lived without Voldemort for so long that even those who had once feared him convinced themselves it was impossible for him to return through a school competition. This collective denial became Voldemort's greatest weapon. Dumbledore himself admitted later that he had begun to suspect a plot, but only vaguely. His hesitation stemmed from the belief that no one would dare infiltrate Hogwarts under his watch. This confidence, though understandable, prevented him from acting sooner. When he finally confronted Moody, the realization struck him with the weight of his own oversight. It was then revealed that Barty Crouch Jr. had been hiding in the castle all year. "I must be getting older," Dumbledore said quietly, acknowledging that even the wisest wizard can misjudge the dangers closest to him. The adult's failure to connect the clues shows how fear manipulates judgment. To suspect Voldemort's return would require confronting trauma they spent years avoiding. Magical Society built a narrative that the Dark Lord was gone, and any deviation from that narrative threatened their emotional stability. It is human nature to avoid conclusions that cause pain, even when evidence demands it. This weakness allowed Voldemort to rise not in a flash of surprise, but through a quiet sequence of ignored anomalies. Perhaps the greatest irony is that Hogwarts was filled with talented witches and wizards capable of brilliance, yet none of them applied analytical thinking to the string of events unfolding before them. Each incident, Moody's behavior, Harry's entry, Crouch's disappearance, Karkaroff's fear, the growing tension, existed like scattered shards of mirror. No one dared assemble them to see the reflection they formed. Voldemort did not hide. He moved boldly, step by step, while the world chose not to look. Number 23. No anti-interference protections on the maze. The third task of the Triwizard tournament was designed to be the moment when the entire magical world held its breath, yet the very structure meant to showcase the pinnacle of magical defense revealed an astonishing vulnerability. The maze stood as a symbol of controlled chaos, towering hedges twisting into darkness, glowing with enchantments meant to challenge even the bravest champions. And yet, despite its fearsome appearance, it was astonishingly permeable. The Ministry and Hogwarts poured effort into crafting obstacles, summoning creatures and weaving complex spells, but no one invested equal energy into safeguarding the maze from tampering. It was a fortress without gates, a challenge without integrity. Much of this illogic emerges when one considers the figure who effortlessly altered the course of events. Barty Crouch Jr., hidden behind Alastair Moody's scarred face and magical prosthetics. His interference was neither subtle nor accidental. He enchanted the maze itself, nudging it to shift, open, or block according to Harry Potter's movements. In Goblet of Fire, Rowling writes that Harry felt the hedges quiver as though stirred by invisible hands, a description that gains new meaning once readers discover the hidden manipulator behind the scenes. These invisible hands belonged to a man who should have been stopped long before his magic reached the maze, yet no spell or monitoring device stood in his way. The core question grows sharper when one recalls that the maze was not built in isolation. It was prepared under the supervision of some of the most accomplished wizards alive, Albus Dumbledore, Minerva McGonagall, and the heads of Beauxbaton and Durmstrang. Each had decades of experience in detection, counter-curses, and magical security. And yet, while the champions were shielded from cheating one another, the very environment they were placed in was left exposed to external manipulation. It is as though architects reinforced every wall of a prison cell but left the door unlocked. One struggles to believe that Dumbledore, a man who once sensed Voldemort's presence through subtle magical disturbances, could overlook such a critical flaw. Perhaps the most bewildering component is that Barty Crouch Jr. operated not from the shadows, but from within the highest ranks of tournament authority. He was a judge. He controlled the placement of obstacles. He stood within arm's reach of the maze's entrance. In the book, Harry recalls that Moody's magical eyes swiveled toward the hedges as though he could see straight through them, a quiet hint that this judge was far more attentive to the maze than he should have been. In any regulated competition, judges are separated from the mechanisms of performance. Here, the opposite occurred. The man responsible for enforcing fairness became the architect of deception. A specific example underscores this illogical gap, the bewitched Imperious curse cast on Victor Crumb. This act alone should have been impossible within the bounds of a magically protected maze. If spells had been placed to prevent outside influence, the moment a champion was subjected to such a curse, alarms should have triggered. The judges should have sensed the intrusion instantly, yet no such alert existed. Harry later describes seeing Crumb with his wand raised, his eyes blank and unfocused, a classic sign of mind control, yet the maze remained eerily silent. It was not merely a failure of oversight, it was a structural failure of magical logic. This deficiency becomes even more striking when compared to earlier Triwizard precautions. The Goblet of Fire itself was protected by an age line crafted by Dumbledore, a spell so precise it reacted instantly to violations. If intricate safeguards could be placed around a simple wooden cup, why could they not be woven into the walls of a gigantic, enchanted maze? One could argue the maze was too large, too magically active, too unpredictable. Yet this only strengthens the criticism. The more complex the task, the greater the need for protective barriers. Instead, the judges embraced magical spectacle and dismissed fundamental security. One might be tempted to assume that Dumbledore trusted the integrity of those involved, but trust without verification becomes negligence, particularly when the safety of students is at stake. Throughout the tournament, Dumbledore demonstrated acute awareness of threats. He stationed merpeople in the lake for Task 2, oversaw dragon handlers during Task 1, and even walked the grounds personally during heightened danger. Yet, on the night of Task 3, the vigilance dimmed. If anything, this lapse feels inconsistent with his character, as though the narrative required Dumbledore's famed intuition to temporarily fail. Moreover, the maze lacked one of the most elementary protections in magical law enforcement: anti-tampering wards. The Aura Office uses such wards to detect when doors are opened, charms altered, or spells cast within restricted perimeters. Barty Crouch Jr. himself, a former dark wizard, was intimately familiar with these measures. He fully expected them to exist, and yet, when he cast his enchantments, nothing resisted him. It is almost as if the organizers never considered the possibility that someone might intervene. This assumption would be laughable if it weren't so catastrophic. The Triwizard tournament was notorious for danger and death. Security should have been the organizers' obsession. Another point of illogic emerges in the way the maze responded to magical influence. When Crouch Jr. bewitched the cup into a portkey, it required altering one of the most fundamental magical safeguards. The cup was not simply an object, it was the finish line, the symbol of victory, and the key to determining the champion. Turning it into a portkey capable of transporting 2 students to Voldemort's location was a profound violation. According to standard magical practice, portkey creation triggers detectable magical ripples, yet not a single professor sensed the disturbance. In the text, Dumbledore later says, "Only a powerful wizard could have enchanted the cup without our knowledge," an admission that feels less like explanation and more like an excuse. Readers are left with the impression that the maze was protected only superficially. It contained creatures such as blast-ended scroots, a sphinx, and an acromantula, but these served merely as challenges, not safeguards. The hedges could shift, but these movements belonged to the maze itself, not any external detection system. In effect, the maze was a wild, living thing, beautifully dangerous yet carelessly unsecured. The illusion of power concealed the absence of protection. Consider the comparison to Muggle sports competitions. At the Olympics, athletes undergo constant supervision to prevent doping or outside interference. Judges are monitored, their actions scrutinized. Any deviation from protocol raises immediate suspicion. Yet in the wizarding world, where interference can occur with a flick of a wand, the judges stood unsupervised. When Crouch Jr. subtly guided Harry through the maze, it resembled a referee quietly placing hurdles where one athlete might stumble and clearing them away for another. The scandal writes itself. The situation becomes even more implausible when recalling that the Ministry was deeply involved in the tournament. Bartemius Crouch Sr., Percy Weasley, Ludo Bagman, and other officials hovered over every event. They discussed rules, enforced regulations, and debated scoring with the seriousness expected of bureaucrats. But when it came to the final and most dangerous task, their vigilance evaporated. The Ministry's oversight should have included layers of anti-cheating magic, yet their presence was symbolic rather than functional. A ministry that routinely patrolled Quidditch World Cups failed to police an international tournament involving minors. This gap in logic ultimately weakens the credibility of the event within the narrative. The Triwizard tournament is framed as ancient, prestigious, and rigorously structured, yet its final challenge fell prey to manipulation unnoticed by the wisest wizards alive. When Harry later recounts that Moody helped me, Moody put me on the right path, readers retroactively see how deeply the cheating ran. The fact that these actions went undetected suggests not merely incompetence, but a systemic failure in magical oversight. Another contradiction lies in Hogwarts' own enchantments. The castle is famously impregnable in many respects. The Forbidden Forest is under surveillance. Even the Room of Requirement, with its shifting nature, adheres to certain magical principles that cannot be overridden casually. And yet the maze, built on school grounds and overseen by the same staff, had none of the castle's natural protections. No enchantment prevented unauthorized spellcasting. No alarm sounded when students were endangered by forces beyond the intended challenges. The maze became a blind spot in a landscape otherwise teeming with magical safeguards. Perhaps the most poetic irony is that the labyrinth, a symbol of mystery and mastery, became the stage for the most preventable tragedy of the year. Cedric Diggory's death, though caused by Voldemort, was enabled by the chain of events that began with unchecked interference. Had the maze been protected, the cup could not have been altered. Had the cup remained untouched, Cedric would have lived. And so the question of magical security becomes not merely theoretical, it becomes painfully personal. The failure to secure the maze cost a life. In the end, the Triwizard Maze stands as one of the wizarding world's most striking paradoxes, a monumental display of magical strength built upon an unexamined weakness. The hedges towered, the creatures roared, and the enchantments glittered, yet the structure remained open to a single wizard with malicious intent. Barty Crouch Jr.'s success exposes a truth the magical community would rather ignore. Danger in the wizarding. World often arises not from the strength of dark wizards, but from the blind spots left by those meant to defend against them. Number 24. No medics, no safety net. The Triwizard Tournament has always been presented as the pinnacle of magical tradition, a test of bravery and skill so ancient that few dared question its structure. Yet when examining the events of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire with a critical eye, an unsettling inconsistency emerges, one that sits awkwardly beside the otherwise meticulous planning in the wizarding world. The tasks are undeniably perilous, involving dragons, deep water environments, and a deadly, shifting labyrinth. But despite such danger, the absence of a dedicated medical team remains one of the most baffling oversights in the entire magical canon. The closer we look, the more this absence appears not merely strange, but fundamentally illogical, undermining the very idea that the organizers cared for the champion's safety at all. Take the first task, where each champion was required to steal a golden egg from a fully grown dragon. A Hungarian horntail was unleashed before Harry Potter's eyes, its iron-like scales, venomous spines, and flame powerful enough to melt stone. Rowling describes the horntail as looking like a colossal prehistoric lizard, emphasizing its lethality. Charlie Weasley himself, an expert in dragon handling, admits within the text that these creatures are nearly impossible to control once agitated. Yet when Harry is nearly crushed by the dragon's tail and grazed by its fire, who stands ready to heal him? No Mediwizard rushes forward, no specialized dragon injury healer from St. Mungo's emerges from behind the stadium walls. Instead, the scene implies that Madame Pomfrey, stationed somewhere in the background, would presumably deal with injuries afterward, only afterward. The notion that a sporting event involving 4 teenage contestants and 4 enraged dragons had no visible emergency response team borders on absurdity. The problem grows more striking when contrasted with how carefully wizards usually treat dangerous magical creatures. At the Quidditch World Cup, the Ministry deployed entire departments to manage a mischievous group of Veela and a team of giants performing stunts. During the crisis involving Sirius Black, Dementors were stationed around Hogwarts to ensure security. Even accidental magic mishaps at school, such as Neville Longbottom's broken wrist, receive immediate medical attention from Madame Pomfrey, who is known for responding within seconds. Wizards clearly understand the need for specialized magical medical care, Yet for the tournament, an event where fatal injury was almost guaranteed, organizers appear to have decided that the champions could simply fend for themselves. The second task only deepens this inconsistency. Champions were required to survive underwater for up to an hour in the Great Lake, an environment filled with grindylows, merpeople, and freezing temperatures. Harry survives only because of gillyweed, an improvised solution given to him by Dobby. Cedric Diggory and Victor Crumb rely on advanced transfiguration. But perhaps the most unsettling case is Fleur Delacour, who never reaches her hostage, her younger sister Gabrielle, because she is attacked by grindylows and forced to retreat. The text notes that she returned to the surface screaming in panic. Yet again, no emergency healers stand by to examine her, warm her, or assess whether the grindylows inflicted deeper magical damage. The lake was enormous, visibility was limited, and champions could lose consciousness beneath the surface. Why was no protective spellwork in place to detect drowning? Why were no merfolk positioned as rescuers instead of passive judges enforcing task rules? Even the merpeople's involvement reveals troubling implications. They were instructed to prevent champions from cheating, meaning they would not intervene if a participant became incapacitated in the lake. Hermione Granger later remarks that Harry could have died had he not discovered gillyweed, and yet no one monitoring the event seemed remotely concerned. The judges complained about Harry's interpretation of the rules, but not one of them questions how catastrophically the task could have ended. We are left with an uncomfortable picture. The Ministry and Hogwarts leadership were ready to risk the lives of 4 students, trusting in luck rather than proper safety protocols. The third task is perhaps the clearest example of negligence. The maze is portrayed as a shifting, sentient entity filled with cursed mist, explosive creatures, homicidal vines, and jinxes capable of driving contestants out of their senses. Harry encounters a blast-ended Scroot powerful enough to split a boulder. He narrowly escapes a patch of mist that warps reality and causes complete loss of orientation. Later, he is attacked by Victor Crumb, who, under the Imperious Curse, attempts to torture Cedric Diggory. In a space where the spell's unforgivable curses can be cast undetected, where champions fight monsters in narrow corridors, where visibility is nil, and where panic can lead to fatal error, why is there no medical presence at the maze's perimeter? No barriers that dispel harmful enchantments the moment a champion collapses? No magical flare system to signal distress? The only safety measure mentioned is that the hedges would be parted by teachers if necessary. But this assumes the teachers would notice someone in danger. The very nature of the maze, silencing, blinding, confusing, makes this assumption foolish. When Harry hears Cedric scream inside the maze, the judges do not react. Only Harry's intervention prevents Cedric from being seriously harmed by Crumb. This lack of oversight becomes tragically symbolic when we remember that Cedric does, in fact, die minutes later after he touches the Triwizard Cup. Though his death occurs outside the maze, the judges are totally unaware of what is happening. The flaw is systemic, a tournament structure based on spectacle, not survival. It is also worth noting that Hogwarts has immediate access to some of the most advanced healers in the magical world. Madame Pomfrey can grow bones overnight, cure venomous wounds, and reverse curses that would keep a normal wizard bedridden for weeks. When Harry loses all bones in his arm during a Quidditch match, she handles the situation with routine professionalism. Why, then, does she not appear as part of a specialized medical team during the tournament? Why do we never see her ready with healing potions, diagnostic charms, or emergency transport spells on the sidelines? The idea that she simply waited in the castle hospital wing while students battled dragons and underwater creatures strains credibility. Dumbledore's presence is sometimes interpreted as a safeguard, as though his watchful eyes alone constituted sufficient protection. But this belief collapses under scrutiny. Dumbledore could not simultaneously monitor 4 dragons, a lake filled with merpeople, and an enchanted labyrinth. Even with his extraordinary skill, he could not physically intervene faster than a properly positioned team of Mediwizards. The tournament was not designed for one man to oversee. And yet the narrative frames Dumbledore as the de facto supervisor, an arrangement that feels narratively dramatic but entirely illogical within a real-world magical context. This absence of emergency personnel also highlights a thematic contradiction. The wizarding world fiercely values youth safety when it is convenient for the story. The Ministry creates the decree for the reasonable restriction of underage sorcery. Hogwarts enforces curfews and bans students from the Forbidden Forest. Quidditch matches paws instantly at the sign of serious injury, but the tournament inexplicably suspends all concern, treating its teenage participants as expendable. This contrast becomes even sharper when Barty Crouch Jr., impersonating Mad-Eye Moody, tells Harry that the tournament represents a chance to show what you can really do. In reality, it became a chance for the adults to show how recklessly they were willing to gamble with student lives. Furthermore, the magical world possesses numerous healing spells that act instantaneously. Episci, Vulnera Sanentur, and Bezoars capable of reversing poisons all exist. Dittany can close wounds as though they had never been there. When Bill Weasley is mauled by Fenrir Greyback, healing charms stabilize him immediately. Why was none of this healing magic integrated into the tournament infrastructure? The irony is striking. Wizards can heal faster than Muggle paramedics, yet they deploy fewer responders in situations far more dangerous. The absence of healers also introduces a narrative discrepancy regarding international magical cooperation. The tournament hosts schools from France and Bulgaria, presenting Hogwarts as a diplomatic epicenter. One would expect foreign delegations to insist upon medical oversight to protect their students. Madame Maxime, fiercely protective of Fleur Delacour, would logically demand healers stationed at each task. Igor Karkaroff, though morally dubious, would hardly allow Victor Krum, Bulgaria's Star Seeker, to enter a lethal maze without medical guarantees. Their surprising silence amplifies just how strangely the adults behave across all 3 tasks. Across the series, Rowling emphasizes the emotional trauma caused by magical injury. St. Mungo's Hospital contains entire wards for long-term spell damage, mental instability from curses, and transformations gone wrong. Gilderoy Lockhart never recovers his memory after a backfired charm. Frank and Alice Longbottom suffer permanent harm from torture spells. Given this deep, established relationship between magic and psychological consequence, it is shocking that the tournament planners did not consider the mental toll on the champions. The maze alone could have left a student catatonic, and yet no mind healers were present to evaluate them afterward. Even the justification of tradition fails to hold. Hogwarts has modernized countless traditions over the centuries, adapting to changes in magical law, society, and safety norms. The Whomping Willow was cordoned off. Dementors were later removed from school grounds. Teachers regularly update protective enchantments. To claim that the absence of medical support stems from ancient tournament customs ignores the wizarding world's demonstrated willingness to revise dangerous practices. Perhaps the most chilling element is that the only meaningful intervention in the entire tournament comes from Harry himself. He summons help for Cedric, saves Gabrielle Delacour, and tries to alert others to Victor Krum's condition. The adolescents show more concern for one another's lives than any adult authority figure. When readers witness Harry clinging to Cedric's body in the graveyard, returning through the portkey while screaming for help, the weight of institutional failure becomes undeniable. The tournament's organizers were not merely negligent, they were catastrophically unprepared for the consequences of their own decisions. And so we are left with an unavoidable conclusion. The Triwizard tournament, for all its grandeur, was orchestrated with a glaring, illogical omission. No healers, no protective contingencies, no magical first response protocols. It asks us to believe that in a society capable of curing broken bones overnight, no one thought to station Mediwizards a few meters from a dragon. The result is a narrative gap so wide that even magic cannot fill it, a reminder that behind the spectacle of the tournament lies one of the wizarding world's most troubling oversights. Number 25. The unclear role of the judges. The Triwizard tournament, so proudly announced as a renewed symbol of unity among magical schools, contains one of the most puzzling inconsistencies in the entire saga, the strange uncertainty surrounding the judges. Readers may remember how the goblet of fire flared blue, how champions stood in the firelight as the hall roared, and yet, even in that moment of grandeur, the composition of the panel responsible for evaluating them remained oddly undefined. A tournament steeped in tradition should have followed strict protocols, clearly published rosters, and transparent scoring. Instead, what unfolds appears suspiciously improvised, as if the structure of the tournament was stitched together by individuals rather than governed by an official body. The judges we do know are iconic: Albus Dumbledore, Olympe Maxime, Igor Karkaroff, and Bartemius Crouch Sr. Each one carries both authority and narrative weight, yet their presence raises more questions than answers. Why these four? Why not representatives from the Department of Magical Games and Sports, who logically should have overseen such a dangerous international competition? Why does the book occasionally mention other officials without naming them, as though the wizarding world casually rotates its arbiters? This absence of clarity becomes more baffling when one remembers that students' lives are at stake. Harry himself notes during the first task that he has no idea which witches or wizards stand behind the scoring table beyond the familiar faces. Such vagueness feels less like world-building and more like a deliberate narrative fog. This fog thickens when one examines how the judges assign points. After Harry escapes the Hungarian Horntail, Fleur Delacour, Victor Crumb, and Cedric Diggory receive scores that seem to fluctuate without any predetermined rubric. The book describes Karkaroff lifting a card with a shockingly low number, prompting suspicion among the crowd. Karkaroff's score was a 4, the text states, delivering a punch of arbitrariness that readers cannot ignore. How could a task involving dragons, possibly the most lethal magical beasts used in any student-oriented competition, be evaluated with no public explanation of criteria? Should bravery matter more than strategy? Should damage inflicted be punished or rewarded? No one clarifies. Judges simply raise cards, and fate solidifies in ink and parchment. If the tournament were a modern sporting event, magical or muggle, such lack of transparency would unleash an uproar. Imagine the Quidditch World Cup if Ludo Bagman randomly shouted scores without referencing rules. Imagine the Wizengamot issuing verdicts without publishing legal grounding. Yet the Triwizard tournament proceeds under a veneer of dignity that cracks the moment the reader scrutinizes its inner workings. Even Percy Weasley, during his brief moment as Crouch's stand-in, seems lost in the machinery of scoring, more preoccupied with formality than fairness. The tournament looks official, but its mechanisms operate like an amateur production held together by reputation alone. The issue becomes far more troubling when we consider Igor Karkaroff's position. The narrative later confirms what many readers instinctively feel. He is not merely biased, but historically dangerous. As a former Death Eater who secured his release by providing names to the Ministry, his moral integrity is dubious at best. And yet he is given full authority to influence the outcome of a deadly competition involving minors. Hermione, always perceptive, hints at how Karkaroff openly favors his own champion, Victor Krum. The text reinforces this bias when Harry notices that Karkaroff consistently awards him lower scores. The sudden revelation of Karkaroff's past casts an even darker shadow. How could any governing body allow a man with a criminal history tied directly to Voldemort's circle to serve as a judge without oversight? Bartemius Crouch Sr., meanwhile, brings a different kind of opacity. During the first task, he appears rigid, precise, and expressionless, but readers eventually learn that his presence at the tournament masks the chaos unraveling in his personal life. He is deeply compromised not through corruption of motive but through psychological deterioration and manipulation by his own son. The passage where Harry encounters him wandering frantically in the forest demonstrates just how unstable he has become. He looked mad, wild-eyed, his robes were torn. When readers revisit earlier scenes, Crouch's behavior seems less like dignified officialdom and more like the fragile performance of a man trying to maintain control. The thought that such a figure was judging a life-risking competition raises questions about the Ministry's competence. Olympe Maxime and Albus Dumbledore are the only judges who appear consistently impartial, yet even they do not mitigate the structural problem. Maxime's loyalty to Beauxbaton is strong, and though she admires Fleur, she displays less overt favoritism than Karkaroff. Dumbledore remains the moral compass of the series, but placing him as chief. Authority in a tournament held at his school undermines the neutrality expected of an international event. Imagine the outcry if the host nation of a global sporting event appointed its own leader as one of the judges. Even Dumbledore's fairness does not erase this conflict of interest. It merely distracts readers through narrative trust.